Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Jafar Hassan. Despite increasing international pressure over the past several months, Israel is showing no signs of stopping its brutal onslaught on Gaza. Adding to that pressure is growing discontent at home, where protesters in Israel have repeatedly demanded that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu step down. A general strike has also hit the country after the Israeli army said it recovered the bodies of 6 hostages in Gaza. Tens of thousands of protesters rallied across Israel to demand a Gaza ceasefire and prisoner exchange deal, as well as early elections. The rallies were followed by a one-day general strike, which interrupted flights and public transport. The country's finance minister said the strikes had no legal basis and would cause economic damage during wartime. Israel's economy was already struggling, as its offensive in Gaza has also hit exports and investments due to growing international criticism. Despite the mounting backlash, Israel last week launched one of its biggest military operations in the occupied West Bank, where more than a dozen Palestinians have been killed. Netanyahu said earlier this year that the war on Gaza would continue into 2025. But can Israel afford to carry it on? For more on the protests and strikes in Israel, joining me now from London is Chris Doyle. He's the Director of Council for Arab-British Understanding, and from Istanbul, Helen Sarı Ertem, Associate Professor at Istanbul Medeniyet University. Great to have you here with us on Straight Talk. Professor Ertem, let me begin with you. After Israel's latest operation in the occupied West Bank killed a dozen people, the Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan released a statement saying that only a handful of countries have taken an economic and political stance against Israel, and that Turkey has stressed that a larger mechanism should put pressure on Israel, which seemed like a direct reference to the United States. So how do you read the situation?
Well, since the very beginning of the latest incidents, Turkey has been a very active participant of the efforts to find a kind of ceasefire between the two sides, which is very important for the Palestinian civilians especially. So the latest call from Hakan Fidan, Foreign Minister of Turkey, is very important, and as you said, he's trying to somehow pull the United States of America as a much more active participant in the solution efforts of this problem.
Now, Chris, let me come to you and talk about the ongoing protests in Israel. Do you think the growing protest that started after Netanyahu refused to sign the ceasefire deal will have an impact on his hold on office? Could he resign or be forced out by his fragile coalition?
That's a very unlikely scenario. These protests are still dominated largely by the Israeli left and center, the liberals in Israel. Yes, they are in large numbers, but you can see that the protests are obviously much larger in Tel Aviv, a liberal Israeli city, than it is, for example, in Jerusalem. No, I think the real way in which Netanyahu might fall is if it comes from cracks within his governing coalition, where ministers resign and they pull support from within the Knesset, where he needs to have really to govern the majority of the members of that 120 strong parliament. At the moment, he has that. And many of those constituent members of his coalition know very well that if it falls and it goes to elections, they could fall with him, that they would not necessarily achieve those sorts of polling results that they did in the past. So it's very hard to see. But it is, and these protests have highlighted, an extremely divided, polarized society. There's a lot of anger against the government about the failure to get hostages out of Gaza, about many other failures, not least, of course, the 7th of October attacks.
Netanyahu is still the prime minister. Netanyahu has still not signed a ceasefire deal. Netanyahu has still not signed a prisoner exchange deal. So I wonder, does he even care about these protests?
Well, if Israel will continue to claim that it is one of the biggest, strongest, best democracies of the Middle East and of the world, then Netanyahu has to somehow step back. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any meaning of calling Israel as a democracy anymore. This has been the trademark of Israel for a long time, although there has been going on a very chronic issue between Palestinians and the Israeli nation, let's say. Israel as a state has been claiming that it's one of the most important democracies of the region. For that reason, I do very much find it significant for the people, Israeli people especially, to show their opposition against Netanyahu. And I do believe that these protests are very important, although Mr. Doyle underlined that they are somehow partial and influential in some parts of the country at the moment. If they grow up, if the number of the protesters reach to millions, for example, it will be much more influential, and these protests will be pressurizing Prime Minister Netanyahu to step back. And maybe this is the best scenario for the United States of America as well, for the countries of the region as well, because Netanyahu somehow chose to be a kind of authoritarian leader, and this is not coinciding with what Israel as a state traditionally claims for. For that reason, I do think that these protests will increase, and I do think that they will be influential on Prime Minister Netanyahu to somehow either change his policy against Gaza, or somehow resign from the government. And I guess this might be the scenario which the United States is working for.
Right. And Chris, let me come to you. While mounting pressure on Netanyahu may not have had any sort of impact domestically, it seems to me that internationally it is having some sort of impact on Israel. For example, the UK just said it would block some arms exports to Israel over humanitarian law concerns. So could Tel Aviv, could Netanyahu continue its war on Gaza without the support of London?
It certainly can without the support of Britain. We're not a major arms supplier. I mean, we are a medium-sized state, and of course we're a member of the Security Council, a permanent one. But really, Israel needs just one country to back it substantively, and that's the United States. It is the Biden administration that has fast-tracked huge amounts of weapons that Israel has deployed in Gaza and indeed in the West Bank, and may yet do in Lebanon at a much greater scale. So it's the United States that really matters. But that said, the fact that Britain is making such a move is an indication the rest of the international community is getting, finally, after 11 months, fed up with the current situation. That there are many countries who can see very clearly that escalation in the Middle East is not in their interest. They may not necessarily care too greatly, some of these leaders, about the fate of civilians in Gaza, but they do care about their economies. They do care about refugee flows. They do care about stability. And I think that will become more of an issue within Europe, that we will want to see an end to this, because a full-scale war that involves Iran, that involves all these other actors alongside Israel, that sucks in the United States, is not in their interests. So I think the pressure slowly builds, but it is not sufficient considering what Israel is doing, which many people consider to be genocide in the case of Gaza, a system of apartheid in the West Bank. So it's little steps at this stage. They have to be welcomed, fine, it's certainly better than nothing. But Israel has to realize that there is a cost to what it's doing. And at the moment, frankly, it's not there. It's been given the green light.
And it's been given the green light by countries like the United States. But historically speaking, Professor Ertem, the U.S. has had a lot of influence over Tel Aviv. But this is what I find very mind-boggling, especially with what's happening in terms of rhetoric coming from the United States. So over the past 3 months, the U.S. President, the White House, the State Department, they have somewhat started to sympathize more with the Palestinians. For example, the U.S. President came out and said that Netanyahu is not doing enough to secure a deal. But even after these statements, the war in Gaza continues. Israel continues to attack governorates across the Gaza Strip, despite calls for ceasefire from Washington. So I wonder, has the U.S. become powerless against Israel now, or has it lost its influence?
Well, that has been let's say, the claim of John Mearsheimer, famous IR scholar, and he has been claiming in his famous book, The Israeli Lobby with Stephen Walt, that if this so-called small Israel is somehow controlling the great power, United States of America. And the situation should be vice versa, but this is what is happening in practice. So Israel is a small country in terms of physical conditions, but it has a huge power in terms of military, in terms of political influence and relations with the Western world. For that reason, I guess nobody can claim that the United States has done enough to stop Netanyahu government, at least not Israel in general, but Netanyahu government to stop, to end his torture against the civilians, against Palestinian civilians, not only in Gaza, in West Bank, in East Jerusalem, in many parts of the occupied territories.
Fascinating insights, Chris Doyle and Professor Helen Sari Artham. Thanks very much for joining me today here on Straight Talk.
Pleasure.